He was a cold billionaire. She was the love he threw away. One call, he ignored it. One night, she vanished. And he didn't know she carried his child. What happens when the love of your life disappears forever, and it's all your fault? Watch until the end to see a story of heartbreak, regret, and a love lost too late. Welcome back to Beyond Color Stories. I'm so glad to have you here. Tell me, where are you listening from today? I know my loyal viewers will stay with me till the very end, and if you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join our family. We have an emotional, suspenseful story waiting for you, so grab a seat, stay tuned, and let's dive in. The evening sunlight spilled across the glass towers of the city, painting the skyline in hues of gold and amber, but inside the penthouse boardroom of Brook Global, all of that warmth seemed distant, almost meaningless. Harry Brooke sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, his sharp features illuminated by the glow of his phone lying just within reach. The screen buzzed again, and the name Ayla flashed insistently, almost like a living pulse against the cold perfection of his office. He studied it with a smirk that was more bitter than amused, a deliberate act of detachment, as though ignoring her could erase the weight of the past. Each vibration felt like a small accusation, yet he refused to bend, refused to answer. The world outside might have been filled with color, laughter, and life, but here, in the heart of his empire, silence reigned, and he clung to it like armor. Far away, under a pale sky that threatened rain, Ayla sat alone on a cold concrete bench outside the maternity clinic, her hands trembling as she clutched her growing belly. The air was thick with the faint smell of antiseptic and wet asphalt, mingling with the scent of her own fear and desperation. Her lips moved in a soft, almost inaudible whisper. "I don't want to die alone again." Each word was soaked with vulnerability, a confession she had never dared to speak to anyone else, not even to the man who had once been her world. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall too quickly, refusing to give the world, or Harry, the satisfaction of seeing her broken. With each silent heartbeat, she begged the universe to grant her one last chance to bridge the chasm that had grown between them, to make him see her, to make him remember what they had once shared. Inside the high-rise office, Harry returned to his boardroom as if nothing had happened. He leaned back in his chair, eyes scanning over spreadsheets, contracts, and graphs, all the evidence of his conquests, both in business and in life. He spoke with a confident, polished tone, laughing lightly as he boasted about acquisitions, mergers, and deals that would make lesser men dizzy with greed. Yet beneath that veneer of power, a strange tension coiled tightly around his chest, a subtle ache he chose to ignore. He told himself it was nothing more than hunger, ambition, or stress. After all, he had no time for weakness, no room for regrets, and certainly no patience for the pleas of a woman who had once tried to hold him in her heart while he was too busy holding the world in his hands. Ayla tried once more, pressing her thumb to her phone with trembling resolve. Another call, another chance. And once again, Harry's thumb brushed down across the screen, silencing her. The phone slid onto the polished desk, vibrating now in quiet frustration, but he pretended not to notice. Each ignored ring became a dagger he did not feel, though it was slowly, invisibly, carving its mark into him. Outside, Ayla wiped her tears with the back of her sleeve, whispering promises to the small life growing inside her. "I'll be strong," she murmured. "Even if the world abandons us, even if he never comes back, I'll be strong." Her voice shook, fragile yet determined, echoing in the empty street as the clinic doors closed behind her, leaving her in a cocoon of loneliness and whispered farewells. Harry tossed the phone aside, the gesture casual, almost disdainful, as if it were a trivial object, a mere distraction from his empire. His eyes narrowed on the skyline beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Yet, for the first time in years, The quiet in his chest felt heavy, unfamiliar, and uncomfortable. A tightness that had nothing to do with his health, a subtle awareness that lingered like a shadow he could not shake. He ignored it, burying himself deeper in numbers, contracts and meetings that demanded perfection, precision and power, convinced that emotion was weakness and love was a distraction he could never afford. Yet, somewhere beneath that rigid exterior, the ghost of something real stirred, a memory of warmth, laughter, and nights that had once seemed infinite. Outside, Ayla's steps were heavy with grief and determination, each footfall pressing her farther from the place where she had hoped to be seen, where she had prayed for acknowledgement, for love, for the man who had once whispered dreams into her ears. She paused at the edge of the street, glancing once toward the distant skyline where Brook Global Tower pierced the clouds like a monument to everything Harry valued more than her. Her lips moved again, whispering a soft, broken goodbye. "Goodbye, Harry," she murmured, the words fragile yet final, carrying with them a weight that even the wind seemed to honor. In that moment, destiny etched itself into the fabric of their lives, a cruel twist that would punish him later with the full force of what he had chosen to ignore the moment he lost her forever. The clinic lights faded. Behind her as she walked, the streetlights flickering with a soft glow, each one casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward her like silent witnesses. Her fingers brushed against her stomach, soothing, protective, a promise to her unborn child that she would survive this heartbreak, that she would nurture, protect and love, even if the father of her child refused to see the life he had created. She did not look back again, but Harry's face hovered in her mind with every step, his sharp jawline, the intensity in his eyes, the coldness he wore like armor. She carried both love and hurt inside her heart, a storm that only grew as the distance between them widened. Meanwhile, Harry finally returned to his luxurious apartment high above the city, the walls of glass and steel reflecting the opulence of his empire, but offering no comfort to the unease curling around his chest. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light like fire, and he raised it to his lips, hoping the burn would erase the unfamiliar ache that gnawed quietly from within. Yet even as he drank, the smouldering memory of her face lingered, vivid and unyielding. The ghost of every kiss, every whispered, "I love you," every night they had spent wrapped in a cocoon of intimacy he had abandoned for ambition and arrogance. The phone lay on the table, silent and accusing, and he could not escape the truth that something had changed, though he refused to admit it. Ayla, walking past the deserted park nearby, shivered under the wind that tugged at her coat, her thoughts looping endlessly around the man who had once been everything. Each memory of Harry was a double-edged sword, cutting through her resolve, even as she reminded herself she no longer needed him, that she could survive without him, that she would raise their child with love he had never shown her. Yet a small part of her could not stop hoping, could not stop yearning for a miracle that she knew, deep down, might never come. Back in his penthouse, Harry's phone buzzed again, this time with a message instead of a call. He ignored it, convincing himself it was meaningless, another plea for attention from someone he had already decided to leave behind. Yet when the brief vibration faded, a strange, hollow feeling spread through him, an unfamiliar emptiness that made the world feel suddenly colder and lonelier than any boardroom, any deal, any triumph could ever be. It was a whisper, faint but persistent, hinting that he had already crossed a line from which there was no return. Ayla finally stopped at the edge of the pier near the clinic, her silhouette framed against the fading orange sky, the wind tossing her hair around her face like wild flames. Her hand rested protectively over her belly, and she whispered a soft prayer, a promise to herself and her unborn daughter that she would survive, that she would live, that she would endure even if the man she loved chose not to come back. She looked out over the water, the reflection of the city lights shimmering like fractured stars, and in that moment she whispered once more, quieter than ever, "Goodbye, Harry." The words carried the weight of finality, of heartbreak, and of a destiny she could no longer share with the man who had unknowingly let her slip from his life forever. Inside Brook Global Tower, Harry leaned back in his chair one last time before the meeting resumed, his mind momentarily still, but the ache in his chest refused to leave, subtle but insistent, a premonition of the storm that would come for him in time. He poured another glass of whiskey and stared out at the glittering skyline, pretending he did not feel the tug of absence, the whisper of regret. Yet deep down, a fragment of him understood, though he refused to acknowledge it. Tonight, he had closed a door he could never open again. And somewhere out there, the woman he loved, and the life they had created together, was walking away into a world where he had no place. The night stretched on, quiet yet ominous. The city alive but oblivious to the drama unfolding beyond its streets. Harry returned to the contracts, the meetings, the power plays, but the hollow ache remained, a subtle rhythm beneath his chest that no amount of business, no triumph, no drink could erase. And somewhere, miles away, Ayla's soft, determined footsteps carried her farther from the man who had chosen ambition over love. Her whispered goodbye, lingering in the wind like a shadow, a silent prophecy of the moment Harry would one day realize he had lost her forever. The morning sun spilled into Harry's penthouse, its golden light slicing across the floor-to-ceiling windows, yet inside the vast room, it did nothing to warm the emptiness pressing against his chest. His body had gone through the motions of sleep, but his mind had not rested. The ghost of Ayla's soft whispered goodbye haunted the edges of his thoughts, prickling at the back of his consciousness like a warning he refused to heed. His phone lay face down on the sleek glass table, a silent witness to the moment his world had started to unravel. When he finally picked it up, half expecting it to be a business alert or another unimportant message, his eyes caught a notification that made the air in the room suddenly stifling. A text from Ayla. His pulse quickened, but his expression hardened immediately into one of casual indifference. He scoffed softly, muttering under his breath, "Another emotional plea." Probably another, "Please, Harry, notice me" message. He set the phone back down as though it were nothing, though beneath the facade something in him twisted uncomfortably, an echo of unease he refused to acknowledge. Minutes later, the door to his office burst open without warning, shattering the brittle calm of the morning. Ayla's best friend stumbled inside, her face streaked with tears, hands shaking as she tried to steady herself, her voice breaking as it tumbled out in frantic bursts. "Harry, she's gone. She disappeared after you ignored her calls. I don't know where she went." The words slammed into Harry with the force of a thunderclap, freezing him mid-step, the confident control he wielded for years shattering into brittle fragments. His chest tightened, an unfamiliar panic crawling up his spine like ice, leaving him momentarily incapable of speech. The boardroom, the skyline, the empire he had built, it all seemed to tilt and spin as though the gravity of the world had shifted beneath him. Pride warred with guilt inside him, a war he had never lost until now. Every instinct that had kept him cold, untouchable, untethered to sentiment, screamed that it wasn't his problem, that Ayla had made her choices and he had the right to ignore them. Yet, deeper than all that, something raw and primal clawed at him, a recognition that he had broken the only woman who had ever truly loved him. He struggled to form words, to brace himself against the tidal wave of fear, but the tears streaming from his friend's eyes made it impossible to maintain the illusion of detachment. He forced himself to speak, to lie, to mask the storm inside. "Her choices, they are her own now. There's nothing I can do," he said, the coldness of his voice a shield against the panic he refused to admit. Even as he delivered the lie, the truth clawed at him relentlessly. He could feel it in the weight of the silence after her friend fled his office, in the emptiness of the conference room, in the way the city lights seemed duller, the air heavier, the empire less solid than it had ever been. That afternoon, he returned home, not to find solace, but a reminder of the life he had neglected. On his desk, glinting softly in the warm afternoon light, lay Ayla's old ring, the one he had given her months ago, the one she had cherished even as he had abandoned the warmth of their connection. The sight of it forced him to stop, his chest constricting as memories of her flooded back in relentless, piercing waves. Her laughter by the water, her soft hands brushing against his, the nights they had spent entwined in passion and trust, all of it now haunted him like a cruel, unrelenting spectre. He picked up the ring, turning it over in his hand as if he could extract the answers from its cold metal. The memory of her voice whispered in his mind, soft and desperate. "I can't lose you, Harry." It was a sound that had once soothed him, once made him feel untouchable, and now it stabbed like ice, each syllable a reminder of how completely he had failed. 100 times he tried to call her, his fingers flying over the screen, desperation painting each attempt, but every call went unanswered. Each ring, unanswered, rang in his ears long after the phone had fallen silent, a cruel chorus of his own failures echoing through the empty rooms of his life. Even as night descended, washing the city in a veil of darkness, Harry could not escape the gnawing fear that had lodged itself in the pit of his stomach. The skyline sparkled with life and ambition below, but to him it was a cold reminder that even the brightest lights could not guide him to the one person who mattered most. He paced, the sound of his shoes on the polished floors a hollow accompaniment to the tumult in his mind. He imagined her alone, shivering in some quiet apartment, clutching the tiny life that carried his blood, wondering if he would ever come for her. The thought made his chest tighten further, each beat a painful reminder that time had already begun slipping irreversibly away. The hours crawled by, each one stretching longer than the last, and Harry felt a terror unlike any he had ever known in the ruthless corridors of power. Deals, empires, conquests. They were nothing compared to this. The sharp edge of panic cut through his pride, leaving him exposed, raw, and painfully aware of how utterly powerless he was against the consequences of his own choices. He tried to push himself toward action, calling friends, assistants, anyone who might know her whereabouts, but nothing brought him closer to her. Each failed attempt was a hammering reminder. He had lost control, he had lost her trust, and for all his wealth and influence, he was now blind and helpless in the most important way. Memories tormented him in relentless waves, each one sharper than the last. Her smile as she kissed him good morning, the soft curve of her lips as they whispered his name in intimacy, the way she had once believed in him when he had refused to believe in himself. Every detail was a blade twisting in his chest. He could feel the spaces where love had been, now replaced by absence and guilt, the emptiness pressing down so heavily that it threatened to crush him. Even his penthouse, a palace of power, felt like a cage, the walls reflecting only the shadow of what he had thrown away. By late evening, Harry's search had become frantic, almost violent in its intensity. He drove through the city streets, stopping at apartments, hospitals, clinics, places she might have gone, each closed door a hammering blow. The reality of her absence, the absolute unknowability of where she was more terrifying than any boardroom battle, more punishing than any business failure. The uncertainty was a wound that bled into every thought, every movement, until all he could do was clutch the wheel of his car and whisper her name into the empty night, begging for a miracle that felt increasingly impossible. Finally, he returned home, exhausted, trembling, his mind spinning with the unthinkable possibility that he had not just hurt her, but destroyed her sense of safety and trust forever. The ring on his desk glinted faintly again, a cruel reminder of what he had ignored, what he had discarded, what he had taken for granted. And deep inside, behind the layers of pride and denial, a small, terrifying thought had begun to take root. He did not know where she was. He did not know if she was safe. He did not know if he would ever see her again. And in that terrifying silence, Harry understood the truth more completely than he had ever understood anything. He had broken the only woman who had ever truly loved him, and now he was utterly powerless to make it right. The night stretched into the early hours, the city quiet except for the distant hum of life that felt foreign to him. He sat alone in his office, staring at the city lights, the ring still clutched in his hand, feeling a fear that was sharper than any he had ever known, a terror born not of money, power, or influence, but of love lost, of a trust shattered, of a future he could not recover. The haunting reality pressed in from all sides, leaving him with a single devastating truth. He did not know where Ayla was, and in not knowing, he had already begun to lose her forever. The room seemed to close in on Harry as he paced restlessly, the weight of the unknown pressing against him with relentless insistence. Every moment that passed without Ayla's presence gnawed at him, a silent, merciless countdown he could neither pause nor escape. His mind replayed the calls he had ignored, the moments of pride that had kept him from picking up the phone, and the sickening realization that every second of his arrogance had cost him more than he had ever imagined. He needed answers, needed to hear her voice, needed to see her, yet the cruel reality pressed against his chest like iron chains. She was gone, and he was blind to her suffering until it had reached a point from which there might be no return. Desperation propelled him forward, driving him to Ayla's best friend's apartment, the only place he could think of where someone might have the truth. He burst through the door, the sharp click of his heels on the polished floor echoing like a gunshot in the quiet space. She turned, startled, her face pale and streaked with tears, her hands trembling as she held onto a mug she barely noticed. Harry's voice came out in a controlled, urgent demand, each word precise but edged with an uncharacteristic rawness. "Tell me, where is she? What happened that night? You have to tell me everything." His eyes searched hers, burning, accusatory, and beneath the sharp veneer of his command, there was an undeniable tremor, a vulnerability he had never allowed anyone to witness before. The friend faltered, her lips quivering as though caught between loyalty and terror, and Harry's patience, already worn thin by fear and guilt, snapped into something sharper, more insistent. "I need to know," he barked, his voice slicing through the fragile air. She inhaled shakily, the room thick with tension, her sobs threatening to spill over into confession. And then finally a cry broke through the suffocating silence, raw and explosive. "She's pregnant, Harry. She tried to tell you that night." The words struck him with the force of a hurricane, obliterating the floor, beneath his certainty, shaking him to the core. For a moment, Harry could only stagger back, the room tilting around him, the walls of the apartment warping into a blur as the truth hammered relentlessly against his mind. Every memory of Ayla came crashing forward in an unbearable wave, vivid, intoxicating, and torturous. He saw her soft lips against his after midnight, the gentle warmth of her hand slipping into his, the laughter she had shed freely as he carried her into the surf on the beach, their bodies pressed together, skin damp and hair wild, with sunlight glinting on the waves. He remembered the night they had made love, her voice soft and trembling as she whispered the dream she had carried close to her heart. A family, a home, a life together. Each recollection was a dagger, each moment a reminder of what he had destroyed with his coldness, his affairs, his unyielding pride, and the selfish belief that nothing could touch him. The crushing weight of guilt pressed on him like a physical force, squeezing his chest and leaving him gasping as he realized the magnitude of what his silence had done. She had been carrying his child, a tiny life that had grown from the love he had abandoned in a single night of thoughtless pride. And now she was gone. Gone from him, untended and unprotected, her world a fragile bubble of fear and loneliness that he had failed to shield. The thought nearly crippled him, leaving him on the verge of collapsing against the floor, his mind screaming, his heart shattering in ways no boardroom battle, no corporate conquest, no worldly victory had ever touched. Shaking, he grabbed his car keys, the metal cold and heavy in his palm, grounding him in the present, while the storm of regret raged around him. His fingers trembled, each second a reminder that time was slipping through his grasp, that Ayla and their unborn child were moving farther from his reach with every heartbeat. "I'll find you, Ayla," he whispered, a vow, a prayer, a desperate command to the universe itself. His voice, hoarse and trembling, carried the raw weight of a man who had learned too late that love ignored could become a wound that bled forever. Outside, the city stretched in endless loops of lights and shadows, each street a maze that threatened to swallow him whole, yet Harry's determination burned hotter than fear. He ran to his car, the tires screaming against asphalt as he tore through streets and avenues, chasing clues, leads, fragments of information that might point him to her. Every alley, every cafe, every quiet apartment building he passed was a potential hiding place, a potential scene of heartbreak, and with each step, the fear that he had already arrived too late clawed higher, tighter, into his chest. Memories continued to haunt him, relentless and unforgiving. He remembered the mornings when she made pancakes, laughing as he accidentally spilled syrup across the table. He remembered her soft sighs in the nights they had shared, her head resting against his shoulder, the slow rhythm of her breath, a melody he had taken for granted. He remembered the words she had once said, the confession of love that he had dismissed, the promise she had made to wait for him even when he turned away. Now each memory was torture, each smile a blade, each whisper a cruel reminder of the consequences of his neglect. The friend's apartment seemed to close in around him as he finally paused, leaning against the wall for support, his knuckles white on the keys still clenched in his hand. She watched him, silent, as though she understood that the magnitude of his realization had shattered more than just his composure. It had cracked open the very foundation of his heart. He could feel it now, the sharp, unrelenting weight of guilt, fear, and heartbreak fused together in a way that no amount of money, power, or influence could remedy. Harry's eyes darted toward the door again, imagining Ayla walking through it, imagining the impossible. Her forgiveness, her trust, her warmth. And then the impossible became terrifyingly plausible. What if he was already too late? What if the distance he had created with his coldness and pride had carved a chasm so vast that no apology, no action, no amount of searching could bridge it? The thought made him shiver, leaving a chill that ran deeper than any winter wind, a fear so raw and uncontrollable that it brought him to his knees in the quiet of her friend's apartment. Every heartbeat echoed in his ears like a drum of impending doom, each tick of the clock marking time he could never reclaim. He imagined Ayla alone, terrified, carrying his child through empty streets or lonely apartments, whispering soft promises to herself, to the life inside her, as he had ignored her pleas. The thought of her suffering, of his child existing in the world without him there to protect and nurture them, drove a raw, burning panic through him that no amount of composure could conceal. The city outside seemed indifferent to his anguish, the lights twinkling like distant stars that had no power to guide him. Yet Harry could not stop. He could not pause. The weight of the secret, the truth Ayla had tried to tell him, the life he had failed to protect, the betrayal of silence, pressed down with relentless urgency. He felt the edges of reality blur as memories, fear, and desperate determination collided inside him. Each passing minute was a torment, each street a possible clue, each unanswered phone a drumbeat of warning. Finally, rising from his knees, he gripped his car keys with renewed resolve, the metal pressing cold against his palm, anchoring him to the present as he prepared to chase the one thing in the world that truly mattered. His lips trembled as he muttered her name again, a prayer, a promise, a plea. "I'll find you, Ayla, wherever you are." And in that instant, fate whispered its cruelest warning yet. The distance he had allowed, the pride he had cherished, the silence he had wielded as power, might have already made the gap between them impossible to close. The engine roared to life as he sped through the city, each turn and street a blur, each heartbeat a drum of anxiety and fear. His mind raced, imagining her every movement, every choice she might make, every tear she might shed. The world around him became secondary, irrelevant, nothing compared to the singular focus of finding her, of making right what he had wronged, of reaching her before time and circumstance cemented a separation he could not undo. Hours stretched like eternity, the city lights bleeding into streaks of gold and white, but Harry's determination burned brighter than exhaustion, brighter than fear, brighter than any obstacle. Every shadow became a potential clue, every passerby a possible witness, every flicker of movement a chance to glimpse her, to hear her, to reclaim even a fragment of what he had abandoned. Yet as he drove, one terrifying, undeniable thought pulsed through his mind like a heartbeat he could not escape. What if he was already too late? What if the very silence he had wielded as power had already destroyed the only woman he had ever truly loved and the life they had created together? The cityscape rolled past in a blur as the night deepened, and Harry's eyes burned with the fire of desperation. Memories of Ayla haunted him, vivid and relentless, each one demanding recognition, each one a reminder of what he had lost. The laughter, the passion, the quiet moments of intimacy, the whispered dreams and promises, all of it came crashing back with relentless clarity, leaving him raw, trembling, and wholly unprepared for the task that now lay before him. As the hours passed, his pulse quickened, the tension building in a crescendo of fear, guilt, and urgency. Every street corner, every silent apartment building, every shadowed alley became a canvas of imagination and horror, painted with the possibility that she might be anywhere, doing anything, alone and unprotected. And still, despite the terror clawing at his chest, despite the gnawing guilt and the cruel anticipation of discovery, Harry refused to stop. He would not rest. He would not pause. He would not surrender to the hopelessness pressing against him from every angle. 4. Ayla stepped off the late afternoon bus, the salty breeze of the coastal town brushing against her face like a whisper of freedom she hadn't felt in months. Her bag, worn and frayed at the edges, rested heavily against her shoulder, though the weight felt almost insignificant compared to the burden she carried in her heart. Each step along the cobbled streets seemed to echo with memories of a life she had left behind, memories of Harry, his arrogance, his cold hands, the nights where passion and pain intertwined until she could no longer tell them apart. She inhaled the sharp scent of the sea, letting it fill her lungs and soothe the frantic, racing pulse that had driven her across cities, away from the empire of glass and steel, where Harry's presence still lingered in every corner, every room. The small inn she had chosen was modest but clean, its whitewashed walls catching the last rays of sunlight, and she allowed herself a tentative hope that here, perhaps, she could finally breathe. The room was tiny, furnished with only the essentials, a bed, a dresser, and a small wooden chair by the window overlooking the cliffs and the endless expanse of water. As she placed her bag down, her fingers brushed the roundness of her belly, and a soft, bittersweet smile graced her lips. "I'll love you," she whispered to the life growing inside her, a quiet promise that even if your father does not, I will never abandon you. The words felt heavy with determination, carrying with them the weight of her loneliness, but also a fragile, fragile hope. She knelt by the small chair, taking out a basket of tiny knitted clothes she had brought with her, each stitch infused with her care and imagination. She held a tiny sweater up against her chest, imagining the warmth of soft, tiny hands that would one day grasp her own, the small fingers curling around hers as she guided them through the world she now had to navigate alone. Each piece of yarn became a testament to her resilience, a declaration that she could survive without Harry, that her daughter's life would be filled with love even if the man who had caused her pain remained absent. Yet, even as she knelt there, a quiet ache pressed against her chest, a reminder that freedom did not erase longing, and independence did not erase heartbreak. Nights were the hardest. The world outside quieted, leaving her in the small room with only the sound of the sea and her own heartbeat. She spoke to her daughter, softly, lovingly, imagining every detail of her future, her laughter, her first steps, the way she might clutch her little hand around a crayon as she learned to write her name. She whispered stories, small fragments of life and hope, promising that she would be strong, that no one could take them away. Yet, in the silence, her thoughts inevitably wandered back to Harry, to the nights she had lain beside him and felt the dual weight of love and betrayal pressing against her heart. She remembered his hands on her waist, his lips whispering possessive promises, and the terrible sweetness of those moments which now felt like distant illusions, ghosts of the life she had once known. Even as she immersed herself in the care and creation of her daughter's little world, loneliness wrapped around her like a cold, unyielding blanket. She tried to smile when she looked at the sunsets spilling gold across the water, tried to imagine a future without him, a life she could build from the fragments of herself he had left behind. She let the waves of the ocean lap against her thoughts, hoping the vastness of the sea could carry away the lingering ache of longing, but the echoes of his voice, of the life she had almost shared, kept creeping back, subtle yet relentless, haunting the quiet corners of her heart. Days merged into nights in the small town, and with each passing day, Ayla found a quiet rhythm, cooking small meals, knitting, walking along the cliffs with the wind whipping her hair, talking softly to her unborn child. She told herself repeatedly, "I don't need him anymore," repeating it like a mantra, a shield against the memories that threatened to drag her into despair. Yet, deep down, a flicker of hope persisted, unacknowledged and fragile, because even in the act of rebuilding her life, part of her could not completely sever the bond they had shared. She carried both love and pain, intertwined like a melody she could not yet forget. Unbeknownst to her, Harry's presence loomed closer with every mile he drove across the cities, guilt and desperation driving him relentlessly toward her. While she wrapped tiny mittens for her daughter and watched the tide pull and release, he was crossing bridges and highways, scanning every town, every inn, every face for the smallest trace of her. The universe, cruelly deliberate, seemed to tease them with near misses, leaving tiny hints, small fragments that might have led to reunion, yet fate's shadow held them apart, just long enough to intensify the suspense, to leave her completely unaware that the man who had shattered her heart was growing ever closer. Even as she placed her hand gently on her belly, imagining the life that would grow and thrive without him, the faintest tug of destiny stirred, a cruel and quiet tension that threaded through the waves, the wind, the very air of the coastal town. Somewhere, Harry's car tires whispered over asphalt, every mile a beat closer to her, while she, in her small room, told her daughter she would be safe, loved, and strong, blissfully unaware that the moment of collision between her solitude and his desperate search was approaching. The shadow of fate, long and unyielding, watched, patient and merciless, setting the stage for a confrontation neither could fully predict. Ayla's life, though seemingly calm, was threaded with small crises. Moments of pain, sudden waves of morning sickness, nights where loneliness threatened to consume her, and the persistent worry about what kind of man Harry truly was, and whether he could ever love fully enough to make up for the damage he had caused. She thought of the life she could build for her child, independent, unbroken and resolute. Yet in the silence of her room, her heart whispered faintly, dangerously, that part of her still hoped, still ached for the impossible. Every step she took along the coastal paths, every glance at the horizon, every stitch of yarn she pulled through the small knitted garments carried with it a quiet tension, a suspenseful weight. She was unaware that fate was tightening its grip, that Harry was driving through the night with the single purpose of finding her, and that the collision of their separate lives was imminent. Every glance she cast out toward the endless ocean was layered with hope, fear, and resignation. While unseen across cities and highways, the man who had once broken her was moving toward her, unaware whether she would greet him with forgiveness, anger, or indifference. As the sun set behind the cliffs, bathing the small town in shades of gold and crimson, Ayla knelt by her window once more, placing a hand over her belly and whispering fiercely, "I will be strong. I don't need him. I don't need anyone but us." Her voice carried both determination and sorrow, a promise to herself and to the child she carried. Yet beneath the certainty of her words, the narrative tension pulsed. Destiny had already begun its work, weaving Harry closer to her doorstep, and the quiet, deliberate planning of fate would soon force their worlds into collision. The story of her solitude was only beginning, and the shadows of the past, present and future hung poised over her like a storm waiting to break. 5. Harry's world had narrowed to a single, relentless purpose. The boardroom, once his sanctuary of power and control, now felt like a cage of meaningless victories. Meetings blurred into each other, deals lost their luster, and invitations to glamorous parties seemed hollow, echoing only his own emptiness. Each glass of champagne, each handshake with smiling executives felt like a reminder of how hollow success could be when the one woman who had ever mattered to him was unreachable. His phone lay heavy in his pocket, full of missed calls and unanswered texts, and yet he could not stop himself from checking it, hoping, praying for even the smallest sign of her. Every second without her gnawed at his mind like a slow, insidious poison. Guilt had transformed into something fiercer, more consuming, a terrifying, aching form of love that he could not ignore. It was a love that burned his chest with every memory, that drove his thoughts into the nights when he lay alone, replaying every detail of their past as though memorizing it could somehow undo the months he had thrown away. He could see her smile, radiant and carefree, illuminating his world in ways no sunlight ever had. He could smell her scent lingering in his memory as if it had been etched into the fibers of his soul, the subtle sweetness of her hair, the warmth of her skin, the fragrance of her presence that haunted every room he entered. Her voice whispered his name in his mind like a melody, soft and pleading, full of meaning he had never truly understood until now. The memories struck him in vivid, piercing clarity. He remembered the night he had carried her in his arms after a sudden downpour, the rain soaking them both as she laughed breathlessly against his chest, her hair plastered to her face, her eyes sparkling despite the cold. He remembered the morning she had danced in his shirt, making pancakes with a carefree abandon that had once made his heart ache with affection, a lightness he had ignored. He remembered the quiet afternoons where she had rested against him, whispering that he was her peace, that in his presence the world made sense, and now each memory felt like both a dagger and a lament, reminding him of the beauty he had destroyed through pride, through selfishness, through neglect. Hope and despair warred within him, intertwining like a cruel dance. He had chased rumors and whispers, following faint traces of her across cities, through the maze of the metropolis he had once ruled with ruthless certainty. Each lead felt like a flame flickering in the wind, fragile, uncertain, yet impossible to ignore. A fisherman in a sleepy coastal village had told him about a quiet, solitary girl who painted sunsets by the beach, a young woman who seemed lost in her own world, yet carried an undeniable presence, a light he could not mistake. The information had stabbed him like a blade, sharp and exhilarating, piercing the weight of hopelessness with a dangerous flicker of optimism. Driving through winding country roads, highways that stretched endlessly into the horizon, Harry's mind spun with images of her, of the bump that would one day cradle his child, of the gentle hands she would lay upon the canvas of her little life, of the eyes that had once looked at him with trust, love, and innocence. Each mile felt like both salvation and torment, a step closer to redemption, yet a step into uncertainty. What if she had healed without him? What if the man who had shattered her once was no longer welcome in her life? The thought gnawed at his stomach, leaving a knot of panic that he could not release, tightening with every mile, with every shadow that flickered past his headlights. He stopped at a small roadside diner, ordering nothing more than black coffee, staring absently at the dark waves of the ocean visible in the distance. The waitress, young and cheerful, smiled at him, but he barely noticed, consumed by the rhythm of hope and fear coursing through him. He imagined her sitting somewhere near these very waters, painting the horizon as if trying to capture some fragment of serenity the world had taken from her. He imagined her knitting tiny garments for their child, whispering promises that he could never have made to her in time, and with every image, the ache of absence pressed harder against him, forcing him to grip the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. Nights were worse. Driving along empty roads, the headlights illuminating only the path immediately ahead, Harry felt the relentless pressure of memory pressing against him. He saw her laughter, the curve of her smile, the glint of sunlight on her hair, the way she had once moved through his world with effortless grace, and he realized that all the business, all the power, all the glory he had accumulated were meaningless without her. His life had been empty in every way that mattered, and the realization came not with clarity, but with a terrifying, suffocating weight that made his chest tighten with every heartbeat. Every town, every small inn, every fisherman's shack became a potential sanctuary for her, a place where she might have sought solace, and he scoured each with a frantic intensity, asking questions with an urgency he had never known in boardrooms, with a desperation no deal could replicate. Some looked at him with curiosity, others with suspicion, yet each time he heard a whisper of her name, a hint of a sighting, his pulse accelerated, his breath caught, and the fire of hope burned fiercer alongside the ever-looming fear. What if she had already erased him from her life? What if the man who finally understood the depth of love had arrived too late to claim even a fraction of what he had lost? The wind whipped against his car as he drove along cliffs overlooking the ocean, waves crashing violently against jagged rocks below, mirroring the storm raging within him. He clenched the steering wheel, knuckles trembling, as he remembered how he had once taken her presence for granted, how his arrogance and affairs had poisoned the moments they had shared. Each memory of her happiness without him now carried the sting of what he could not yet reclaim, a relentless reminder that love ignored could transform into something fragile, even fleeting, if not nurtured with care and courage. Harry's mind continued to spiral with haunting recollections, the stolen mornings, the whispered promises, the nights of passion and laughter, the tender moments where their hearts had intertwined with a certainty that had now been shattered by time and neglect. And yet, with every memory, a spark of resolve flared within him. He would not give up. He could not give up. She had carried his child, a tangible, living connection to the love he had abandoned, and that bond demanded action, demanded pursuit, demanded a reckoning. As the night deepened, he finally reached the small coastal town that fit the description he had been given. Lights twinkled faintly across the shoreline, and the rhythmic pulse of waves against the shore seemed almost synchronized with the frantic thump of his own heart. He parked his car along the main road, staring out at the horizon where sky met water, searching for any sign of her. The thought that she might reject him, that she might have healed, that she might no longer want him, gnawed at him with a ferocity that made every muscle tense, every nerve alive with anticipation and fear. Harry walked along the boardwalk, every step heavy with hope and dread, scanning windows, small cottages, the soft glow of lamps illuminating interiors that might conceal the woman who had become his world. Each shuttered window, each flicker of candlelight, each shadow cast on the walls seemed pregnant with possibility, with the potential for both reunion and heartbreak. He imagined her glance, the first look he would see when he finally found her, and he shivered with a combination of longing and terror, a storm of emotion that no business strategy could ever prepare him for. The realization of how much he had lost and how much he still could regain pressed against him like a tidal wave. He knew he was treading a dangerous line between hope and despair, between the thrill of possibility and the agony of rejection. Each step toward the unknown, the girl who carried his child, the woman who had once been his everything, was a step into a world he had never navigated before, a world where love, raw and unguarded, demanded courage greater than any corporate conquest, greater than any empire he had built. Every passing minute in the town intensified the suspense, every shadow flickering in alleyways, every distant figure by the beach could be her, and Harry's breath caught with each possibility. The single, relentless thought that had consumed him since the first day he realized what he had lost, repeated over and over in his mind. What if she longer wanted the man who had finally understood love only after losing her? That thought, terrifying in its potency, fueled a desperate, unrelenting pursuit, pushing him forward through streets, toward the unknown, toward the fragile promise that the woman who had been his world might still be within reach. Harry's car tires crunched softly against the gravel outside the small coastal apartment, a sound so mundane yet to him it rang like the tolling of a bell, marking the end of months of searching and the beginning of a reckoning he had been both terrified and desperate to face. His chest tightened, the adrenaline coursing through his veins mixed with fear, guilt, and a yearning so acute it made his hands shake as he reached for the worn handle of the door. He had imagined this moment countless times during the long drives across highways and cities, each scenario more fantastical, more desperate than the last. Yet none had truly prepared him for the reality of seeing her again, seeing the life he had abandoned, the woman who had carried his child through months of solitude, pain, and heartbreak, standing before him like a fragile yet unyielding force. When the door opened, the sight of Ayla froze him entirely. The soft glow of the apartment's single lamp illuminated her features, tired, wary, yet strikingly beautiful, and the gentle curve of her belly was undeniable. Time seemed to slow, the world narrowing to the room, the space between them, and the weight of every choice he had ever made crashing down upon him. "Ayla," he whispered, the sound trembling, laden with desperation and sorrow, as if saying her name could somehow undo the months of silence, the missed calls, the pain he had caused. His voice cracked, betraying the stoic control he had always maintained in boardrooms, parties, and every arena of his empire. Ayla stepped back instinctively, her body rigid, eyes flashing with a mix of shock, fear, and anger. Her hands rested protectively on her belly, an unconscious barrier against the man who had once held her heart so carelessly. "Harry!" she said, her voice steady yet sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. "Do you have any idea what you did? Do you know how long I waited, how many nights I cried alone, thinking you would never care?" Her words struck him like blows, each syllable a reminder of the consequences of his arrogance, each pause a weight heavier than any deal he had ever closed. The apartment was small, suffused with the scent of the sea that drifted in through the open window, mixed with faint traces of vanilla from a candle she kept for herself and the child she carried. Memories assaulted Harry like waves, crashing relentlessly, of nights spent wrapped in each other's warmth, laughter echoing through empty rooms, the whispered promises of love that had been broken by his pride and negligence. He saw the curve of her lips, smiling at some long-past joke, the softness of her hands tracing his jawline, the way she had once melted against him in the quiet of the night, and the weight of all he had lost threatened to crush him entirely. In an impulse born of desperation and humility, Harry fell to his knees before her, shaking, tears blurring his vision as he pressed his forehead gently against the curve of her belly. "I didn't know. I'm sorry. I love you," he whispered, his words raw, fractured and vulnerable, each syllable trembling with the sincerity he had failed to show for months. The sound of his own voice, so unlike the commanding tone he wielded in business, startled him, yet he could not stop. He needed her to hear, to know that even if it was months too late, he had finally understood the depth of his mistakes, the magnitude of the love he had ignored until now. Ayla's composure broke instantly. Tears spilled over, hot and unrestrained, as the years of hurt, loneliness and longing poured out of her. She clutched her belly protectively, her sobs racking her frame as she remembered the nights when she had longed for him to hold her, the quiet desperation of the hours he had left her alone, the sharp sting of rejection that had echoed through every corner of her being. Yet even in her sorrow, her anger burned fiercely. She refused to be weak again, refused to let the man who had abandoned her rewrite her strength. "You," she gasped between sobs. "You left me when I needed you most. Do you even realize what that feels like?" Harry's tears fell freely now, wetting her hands as she instinctively recoiled, a mix of guilt, longing and rage coursing between them. Every heartbeat screamed his remorse, every breath was a plea for forgiveness, yet he could see the wall she had built around herself, a barrier stronger than any fortress he had ever commanded. I don't know how to fix it. He stammered, clutching the edge of her chair, desperate for some connection, some proof that he could still be a part of her world. His voice cracked under the weight of unspeakable regret, carrying the raw, unfiltered truth of a man who had learned love only after losing it. Ayla's gaze shifted from him to the belly that bore his child, and her chest tightened with both love and despair. The small life growing inside her was his reminder of everything he had destroyed, and yet the same life gave her a resolve as unyielding as stone. She pressed her palms over her face for a moment, inhaling shakily, attempting to steady her racing heart. And then she made the decision that would mark this night indelibly. Without another word, she shut the door between them, leaving him kneeling on the floor in a mixture of anguish and awe. Harry pressed his forehead against the cold wood, whispering her name like a prayer, each repetition a desperate attempt to bridge the chasm his pride had created, yet he knew, deep in his soul, that the barrier was both physical and emotional, and breaking through it would demand more than apologies. Outside the door, the night wind stirred, carrying the faint scent of the sea, a mournful echo of the life he had lost and the life he desperately sought to reclaim. The quiet hum of the town seemed to amplify the sound of his own ragged breaths, his heart beating in frantic anticipation of the next moment, the next chance, the possibility that she might open the door again. Every creak of the floorboard behind him, every flutter of curtains in the gentle breeze seemed like a signal of hope and fear intertwined, teasing the tension between what had been lost and what might still be saved. Time seemed to stretch, elongating each second into a lifetime as Harry remained on his knees, the wooden floor pressing against his palms, the sharp sting of failure and regret mingling with a fragile glimmer of hope. He had finally found her, finally reached the threshold of the life they could have shared, and yet the one barrier that mattered most, their hearts, wounded and weary, remained steadfastly closed. He whispered again, softer this time, a vow wrapped in trembling words. "I won't leave you. I'll wait. I'll fight. I'll do whatever it takes." The sound of his voice faded into the night, leaving only the echo of his desperate longing and the weight of the choices that had brought them to this fragile, heart-wrenching moment. Even in the darkness, even in the silence of the closed door, the tension hung like a storm about to break. Harry knew the path ahead would be fraught with pain, that forgiveness could not be demanded, that love alone would not undo the months of abandonment. Yet he also knew that for the first time in his life he felt the true magnitude of love. Not the casual affection he had taken for granted, not the fleeting indulgences of desire, but a love so deep, so terrifyingly real that it consumed every fiber of his being. And as he stayed there, kneeling on the floor, whispering her name like a prayer against the unyielding barrier, the night stretched on, a night charged with tension, yearning, and a promise that nothing would ever be the same again. 7 days bled into one another, each indistinguishable from the last, yet every day carried its own weight for Harry. The relentless ache of absence had become a constant companion, a throbbing reminder that time waited for no one, that every moment he had wasted while she suffered alone could never be reclaimed. He no longer cared about meetings, contracts, or the clamor of the city's elite. Those hollow victories had no meaning when the woman who had once been his world remained just out of reach. His focus narrowed to the small apartment where Ayla lived, and every movement, every plan, every breath he took revolved around the possibility of reaching her heart, of proving that his remorse and love were not fleeting, but eternal. Every morning, without fail, he would leave small tokens at her doorstep, a bouquet of roses, a note written with trembling hands, a carefully wrapped toy for the child she carried. Each gift was a silent plea, a fragment of his soul he was offering without knowing whether she would ever accept it. He imagined her eyes scanning the items with suspicion, with indifference, with guarded curiosity, and though she had not yet spoken to him, even the thought that she noticed his presence, that she saw him trying to bridge the chasm he had created, was enough to drive him to continue. Each day, he watched from a distance, hidden behind rain-slicked trees, across the narrow street, or in the shadows of alleyways, never daring to intrude, yet feeling the relentless pull of his own desire to be near her. Ayla, for her part, watched from the window with a wariness born from months of pain. She tried, over and over again, to convince herself that she didn't care, that she could maintain the fragile cocoon of independence and protection she had wrapped around herself. She told herself that she no longer needed the man who had abandoned her, who had been blind to the life growing inside her, who had ignored her calls when she most needed his presence. But every time she saw him, soaked from the rain, clutching a toy or a note meant for their child, a pang of longing stabbed her heart. Her pulse would quicken, her breath catch, and she would press her hands against her belly, feeling the tiny life inside, and for a fleeting, terrifying moment, she wondered if she could ever forgive him, if she could allow him back into a world she had painstakingly rebuilt without him. One night, the tension escalated beyond anything Harry had ever imagined possible. He had left another toy, a small hand-knitted outfit, on the doorstep, and the rain fell in torrents, drenching the pavement and his coat, soaking through to his skin as he waited in silence. His fingers gripped the wet fabric of the toy, his heart hammering against his ribs as he waited for a sign. And then, a sound, A sharp, panicked cry split through the night, sending a jolt of fear through him so intense that he almost dropped the bundle in his hands. It was Ayla. The sound of her pain, so intimate and human, shattered the barrier between them, pulling him forward with the force of inevitability. He sprinted through the rain, each step fueled by desperation, every thought consumed with the singular need to reach her, to keep her safe, to make amends in whatever way time still allowed. The moment he reached her apartment, the door flung open, and Harry's eyes fell upon her, collapsed on the floor, clutching her belly with a shuddering gasp. Her face was pale, slick with sweat, eyes wide with fear and pain, and for a fraction of a second, the world narrowed to the two of them and the fragile life she carried. Without hesitation, he scooped her into his arms, feeling the tremor of her body, the sharp cries that tore from her throat, and the helplessness of a man who had once abandoned her, now burning with every ounce of protective instinct he possessed. "I'm here. I got you," he whispered, his voice breaking under the weight of urgency and love, cradling her as if holding her could somehow erase the months of neglect, as if the strength of his arms could shield her from every fear she had endured alone. Ayla buried her face against his chest, hot tears running down her cheeks as every memory of their past surged violently. The nights of passion that had seemed eternal, the laughter they had shared, the quiet mornings where love had been effortless, the warmth of his presence before business and pride had poisoned everything. Each recollection struck her with the duality of longing and anguish, reminding her of what she had lost and what she still could not forget. Her sobs shook her frame, and Harry's hands, steady yet trembling with fear, held her tighter, whispering incessantly, "I'm here. I'm not leaving. I won't let anything happen to you or her. I promise." When the doctor arrived, rushing through the door with efficient urgency, Harry did not relinquish his hold. His eyes, bloodshot from sleepless nights and tears, remained fixed on Ayla, tracking her every shiver, every wince of pain, every shallow breath. He assisted where he could, never letting go, refusing to let her slip into the darkness of despair again. And even as the medical team worked with precision, her gaze found his, haunted and weary, and she whispered the question that had tormented her heart for months. "Why didn't you choose me, Harry?" The words pierced him with the precision of a scalpel, cutting through the veneer of power, control, and confidence he had cultivated his entire life. His voice, hoarse and broken, barely escaped his lips, yet it carried the raw, unshielded truth of a man who had finally understood the depth of his own failings. "Because I was a fool. I didn't know what love was until I lost you, until I saw what I had destroyed, until I realized you and our child were the only things that ever truly mattered." His admission hung heavy in the room, a fragile, vulnerable confession that left the space between them suspended, charged with emotion, the storm of past mistakes colliding violently with the possibility of redemption. Silence followed, thick and suffocating, a pause that seemed to stretch into eternity. The room smelled of antiseptic and rain, of fear and determination, of the faint, lingering fragrance of Ayla herself. Harry's arms remained wrapped around her, a shield against the world, a promise that he would no longer fail her, and yet the tension was unbearable. Would she forgive him? Could love survive the cruelty of months lost, the absence, the neglect, the silence that had almost destroyed everything? The question hung in the air like a storm cloud, pregnant with potential heartbreak, or the fragile birth of hope. Even as the night wore on, Harry remained by her side, a silent sentinel, whispering her name, murmuring apologies, repeating promises that he could no longer take back, yet fearing that words alone would never be enough. The rain outside continued to pour, tapping against the windows like a relentless drumbeat, each drop echoing the intensity of the emotions raging inside him. And as Ayla's pain gradually eased, her breathing becoming more even, her sobs subsiding into occasional hiccups, Harry realized that destiny had granted him one final chance, but the fragility of it, the impermanence of forgiveness, and the weight of months lost would test him, their bond and their love, in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The hours stretched like a living entity, slow and unrelenting, as Ayla's cries echoed through the quiet apartment, the sound sharp, raw, and filled with the history of pain, fear, and longing that had accumulated over months of abandonment. Harry refused to leave her side, kneeling beside the bed or clutching her hand in his, each tremor of her fingers sending jagged shards of terror through him. Every scream she let out pierced him more deeply than any business failure, more acutely than any betrayal he had endured in the world outside, and with each one he whispered desperately, "I'm here. I'm not leaving. I won't let anything happen to you, I promise." His voice cracked, breaking under the weight of emotion he had never allowed himself to feel before, yet he knew that it had been this very vulnerability he had ignored, that had pushed her away, that had almost destroyed everything. Ayla's breaths came ragged, shallow, interrupted by sharp cries as her body convulsed in waves of labor. She gripped Harry's hand like a lifeline, digging her nails into his skin, her eyes filled with pain and tears that streaked down her cheeks. "It's too late. It's all too late. My heart has been bleeding too long," she sobbed, her words shattering the air between them, cutting through the fragile hope that had begun to bloom since their reunion. Harry's chest ached as he felt the weight of her words, guilt and desperation intertwining in a way that left him trembling, his own tears falling freely as he whispered, voice breaking, "No, no, it's never too late. I know now, I see now. I will never leave you again. I will love you until my last breath, Ayla." His arms hovered over her, his hands brushing against hers, tracing every contour, memorizing the life he had almost let slip away forever. Every contraction was a storm, every cry a tempest of both anguish and miracle. Harry felt powerless in ways that no boardroom, no deal, no fortune had ever made him feel, yet he refused to yield, refused to let the past define this night. He pressed soft kisses against her hand, whispered memories from their nights together that had once seemed trivial, now lifelines in the terror of the moment. "Remember the night of the rain, the one where we danced under the storm and you laughed like it was the only sound in the world?" he murmured. "I remember every smile, every laugh, every touch, and I'll remember them until my dying day." Ayla's tears fell freely, mingling with sweat and pain, and yet a fragile smile flickered, a tiny spark that Harry clung to with desperation. As labor intensified, the room became a crucible of love, fear, and raw human emotion. The pale light of the lamp cast shadows on the walls, mirroring the turmoil in Harry's heart. He held her hand tightly, pressing his forehead against hers when her screams grew unbearable, whispering words he had saved for a lifetime but had never said, "I love you, I was blind. I am so sorry, I will never let go. I can't live without you. You are my world, Ayla. You and our baby are everything." Every word was soaked in tears and fervent desperation, each repetition a plea for forgiveness he feared she might never grant. The intimacy of the moment was overpowering, not just physical but emotional, binding them together in the quiet agony of their child's arrival. Ayla's gaze, despite the pain, found his again, searching, seeking solace in the tear-soaked eyes of the man who had finally realized the depth of his love. She remembered the nights he held her like she was the only existence that mattered, before business, before affairs, before pride had poisoned everything. Those memories, once a source of hope, now collided violently with months of suffering, leaving her both broken and helpless. I loved you more than life," she whispered through tears, her voice trembling yet firm, breaking him completely as the raw confession reached deep into the core of his being. The words struck him like lightning, each syllable igniting a fire of longing, regret, and unspeakable grief that no wealth or power could ever soothe. The room trembled with anticipation as the first cries of their baby girl broke through the tension like fragile sunlight piercing a stormy sky. Harry, overwhelmed by emotion, instinctively reached for her, his arms trembling as he gently lifted the newborn, her tiny fingers curling instinctively around his own. Ayla, exhausted and trembling, weakly reached for her daughter, and Harry placed the infant carefully into her arms. Her lips parted in a tired, fragile smile, whispering, "She has your eyes." And in that moment, joy and heartbreak collided violently within him. He could barely bear the sight of her, pale and fading, strength ebbing with each shallow breath, yet she held their daughter, the embodiment of hope, love, and the future they had been denied until now. Suddenly, the color drained from her face. Harry's heart lurched violently as he watched her lips grow pale, her eyes flicker, and her breaths shorten. Panic overtook him, raw and unfiltered, and he pressed himself against her, shaking her gently, his hands trembling with terror. "Ayla, no, no, don't leave me now, please. Stay with me, I beg you." His voice was hoarse from screaming, sobbing, and sheer desperation. Every doctor's intervention, every assistant's movement seemed slow, inadequate against the tide of fear crashing over him. Time became a blur. The world reduced to the fragile heartbeat of the woman he had finally understood, finally loved beyond measure, and whose life now hung by the finest, most delicate thread. She lifted a trembling hand, brushing his cheek with a softness that belied her weakness. Her voice, barely audible, carried the weight of love, farewell, and a command that would haunt him for eternity. "Take care of her, Harry." And with those words, her eyes closed slowly, softly, leaving him cradling both the tiny life of their daughter and the woman who had taught him the meaning of love, the woman he had lost too late. His screams echoed through the room, a raw, broken sound of grief, guilt, and an unending vow, mixing with the faint cries of their baby, a haunting juxtaposition of loss and hope, despair and continuation that would define the rest of his life. Harry held her lifeless body in his arms, rocking slightly, whispering apologies over and over, his tears wetting her hair, his voice strangled with uncontainable anguish. Outside, the storm that had been Labour's backdrop continued its relentless rhythm, mirroring the turmoil in his heart. Every thought, every memory, every regret collided in his mind with the intensity of a hurricane, leaving him shattered, aware that this night, this Labour, and this final goodbye had forever altered the trajectory of his life. Yet even in despair, the tiny heartbeat of their daughter in Ayla's arms remained a beacon, fragile yet enduring, a testament to the love they had shared and the legacy he was now tasked with preserving. Even after the room calmed, the doctors departed, and the reality settled around him, Harry remained frozen, rocking in place, whispering Ayla's name with broken insistence, cradling the child she had brought into the world. The world outside continued as if nothing had changed, yet for Harry, everything had shattered and reformed in the crucible of those terrifying hours. The night had delivered both the ultimate gift and the ultimate heartbreak, teaching him in the cruelest way that love, when denied and delayed, carries consequences that even wealth, power, or ambition cannot mitigate. 9. The room fell into a suffocating silence, broken only by the soft, desperate cries of their newborn daughter. Harry's world had contracted into that tiny, sterile space where life and death collided violently, where love and loss intertwined with unrelenting force. He held Ayla's lifeless body against his chest, her skin cold beneath his hands, her breathing absent, and the stark reality slammed into him with a force so crushing that it nearly stole his own breath. Every heartbeat that once carried hope now became a drum of unbearable grief. His tears fell freely, wetting her hair, his cheeks, and dripping onto the hospital floor. And with every sob, he screamed apologies that would never reach her ears, confessions of love that had arrived months too late, and promises that could no longer be kept. "I'm so sorry, Ayla. I'm so sorry," he cried, his voice raw, guttural and broken, a sound that would echo in his mind for the rest of his life. In the corner, their baby girl wailed, small and fragile, completely unaware of the world-shattering loss she had just endured. Harry's heart tore in two at the sight, the juxtaposition of her innocent, trembling cries against the stillness of Ayla's body forming a jagged scar in his soul. He gently placed the baby against his chest, cradling her with trembling arms, and felt the faint warmth of life that Ayla had nurtured within her, now outside, dependent on him alone. Every instinct, every fiber of his being screamed to protect both the daughter he had almost abandoned and the memory of the mother who had loved him unconditionally until her final breath. His hands shook as he adjusted the blanket around their child, pressing her tiny head to his shoulder as if his embrace alone could shield her from the pain that had already entered their lives. The doctors and nurses moved around him, professional yet impersonal, voices clipped with urgency as they documented what had happened, offered words of condolence, and attempted to assist with the care of the newborn. Harry barely registered them, his mind consumed entirely by the enormity of the void Ayla's absence had left behind. Her absence was not simply physical, it was a gaping chasm where light had once existed, a hollow that no wealth, no success, and no achievements could ever fill. He kissed her cold forehead, lingering with a tenderness that he had denied her countless times, whispering words into the space where life had departed. "I'll love you for the rest of my life. I swear, I'll love you forever. I'll never forget you, Ayla." His lips pressed to her skin as though transferring some measure of his love could somehow revive her, or at the very least honor the bond they had shared, the love they had created, the family they had become too late to protect. Hours passed, though Harry could not tell if it was minutes or days. He remained on the floor beside her hospital bed, cradling their daughter against his chest, rocking her gently as though by keeping her close he could shield her from the awareness of the devastating truth. He whispered stories to her, tiny words of comfort and love, describing her mother's laughter, the sparkle in her eyes, the warmth of her touch, the nights when she had danced barefoot in the kitchen, the moments of passion and tenderness Harry had once ignored. Every story, every whispered word, was a fragile bridge between memory and reality, a way of keeping Ayla alive in the small, innocent mind of their child and in the deepest recesses of Harry's own shattered heart. Even as days turned into weeks, the shadow of grief never lifted. Harry's life became a careful balance between raising their daughter and navigating the emptiness that had once been filled with Ayla's presence. Each smile from their child was bittersweet, a reminder of what he had almost lost and indeed had lost irrevocably. He devoted himself entirely to her upbringing, teaching her about the love she had never fully experienced, instilling in her the values, stories and warmth that Ayla had embodied. Each night, before sleep claimed their daughter, he would recount tales of her mother's beauty, her strength, her laughter, and the love that had once bound them so completely. In doing so, Harry tried to repay, in some infinitesimal way, the debt of love he had failed to give when it mattered most. But Harry's grief was not confined to private sorrow. He poured his energy, his fortune, and his influence into building something that could immortalize Ayla's memory, a foundation dedicated to single mothers, to women who, like Ayla, fought against the cruelty of circumstance, abandonment, and despair. The Ayla Brooke Foundation became a living tribute, a testament to her compassion, her strength, and the love that had been denied in life but preserved in legacy. Each program, Each initiative, each life touched by the Foundation's work was a reflection of the woman who had shaped Harry's heart, a monument to the love he had finally understood and the consequence of the time he had lost. Even years later, when wealth and influence surrounded him like a protective shield, Harry remained haunted by that night, by the weight of Ayla's final words, by the memory of holding her as life slipped away. Yet, in the tender presence of their daughter, he found the reason to keep moving forward, to honor the mother who had given her everything, even when he had failed to give her the most important thing, his love in time. Every bedtime, every whispered story, every gentle hug was infused with remembrance and devotion, and each day was a vow, a promise that Harry would ensure her mother's legacy endured through love, action, and care. Finally, when he stood at Ayla's grave, the crisp wind brushing his face and leaves rustling gently around him, he pressed his hand to the cold stone, eyes wet with tears that had never fully dried. He whispered, barely above a breath, "I lost you, but I'll love you forever." The words were heavy with sorrow, remorse, and undying devotion, yet within them was also a seed of hope. The recognition that while death had stolen her from him, her essence lived on, in their daughter, in the lives he had touched through her foundation, and in the infinite expanse of love she had left behind. And in that moment, Harry knew that though he could never undo the past, he could honor it, cherish it, and let it guide the rest of his life, forever bound to the memory of the woman who had taught him what it truly meant to love. Wow. What an intense journey of love, heartbreak, and regret. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And remember, every story here at Beyond Color Stories is filled with emotions that stay with you long after the video ends. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that will move you. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next unforgettable story.